Some people have said that in the recent financial crisis we were recycling savings from high savings economies into another emerging market economy called the U.S. subprime mortgage industry.
The financial meltdown of the last few years, in my view, is more due to government failure than to market failure.
The direction of drift in Canada is the erosion of the public space.
So like, how could we have an economy that in some ways is quite resilient? How could we let it get to that point, right? And the word I think that I would use is imbalance, right? And you can use that in so many different ways, but a couple of the ways at the high level are, of course, the famous global imbalances, and that refers to really this kind of changing hegemon again, right? But the rise of Asia and the rise of China and the fact that the Chinese have a 50% savings rate meant that there was just a lot more savings in the world, okay? At the same time, the US is kind of accepting these savings. They're not kind of dragging the savings in. The savings are actually being pushed out, and as the savings rate is rising, the interest rate is falling. And that's a real tough, to have sort of such a dramatic change in the interest rate. The interest rate goes down to kind of 2%, 3%. You sort of say, well, how can I save for my retirement? Okay. So people say, well, how can I get the, and certainly, probably many of you in the room were saying, well, gee, I kind of sort of thought, when I thought about it, I thought I'd get, I don't know, 6% rates of return without taking on huge amounts of risk. I thought I would get a 6% rate of return. And if you're going to get 2 to 3% rates of return, then your savings aren't going to be there for retirement. So then you kind of start to say, well, how can I get a higher rate of return? You say, well, maybe you could take on a bit of risk. And so there was this real search for how can we get a higher rate of return. And then when people said, well, really, you won't have to take much more risk on, oh, okay, well, that's all good, right? Or we've got new fancy ways to reduce the amount of risk. Then you say, oh, okay, I believe that. And you kind of go out and you sort of, maybe you don't ask quite as many questions as you otherwise should. Very much a belief amongst economists, or some economists, that the imbalance in the American economy in terms of income inequality was a key piece of what was happening over the last 10 years. Okay? So as income inequality worsened, and perhaps more so, as US household income stagnated, all right? So you'd hear, oh, we have growth in the economy, we have growth in the economy, we have growth in the economy, but the lived experience was one of stagnant real household incomes. And so you say, okay, well, how are you going to sort of deal with these people who might be complaining that their incomes haven't risen? Why is everybody else getting better off? If consumption levels rise, maybe it's not so bad, right? That income levels were constant. So how can you get consumption to go up if income doesn't change? You borrow, right? So that was kind of another sort of feature. You kind of try to make it easier to buy a house so that housing goes up. You try to make it possible for people to use the equity in their house to increase their consumption. So you sort of try to find ways to make people's consumption go up when their income hasn't changed. And so that was another kind of underlying tendency in the economy that was helping to build up and create this environment that was conducive to, when you stir the big pot, creating less resilience and a more fragile.
And all financial crises, all, is my thesis, throughout history have exhibited two things. An excessive concentration of leverage, an excessive amount of leverage, too much debt relative to the value of things, and excessive concentrations of risk that usually weren't understood. And sometimes were understood through amnesia, I think. Or maybe it was willful. I also worry a little bit if we're trying to have watershed moments as opposed to wasted opportunities about the mug's game of blame. There's plenty of blame to go around here in this recent financial crisis. Plenty. Governments, policies, the U.S. subprime mortgage, we used to talk about recycling savings into emerging market economies. And that was a challenge for the global economy. Well, some people have said that in the recent financial crisis, we were recycling savings from high savings economies into another emerging market economy called the U.S. subprime mortgage industry. That was a deliberate policy of the government of the United States. And no regulatory system can stand against a tsunami that hits it from those sorts of kind of things. Traders, regulators, there's failures all over the place here. In the US and UK, we talked about it a little bit. And greed and hubris can't be legislated away. You can have all the rules you want, but greed and hubris can't be legislated away.
Why haven't we been able to make headway? So let me suggest there's 4 reasons that are blocking us. First, if I can borrow the title of a 2-star movie, we have a failure to launch. In our decade-long work on innovation, we determined that when it comes to creating knowledge and sharing it, Canada actually does pretty well. Where we fall down is we don't cash in on our creativity. Last year we did this major benchmarking report. We used outcome indicators, not how much we spend and how much input, but actually we looked at things like patents or the proportion of our knowledge-intensive industries as a share of our domestic economy or as a share of our exports, and we had about 14 of these indicators. And what did we find? We find that we ranked 14 out of 17 developed countries. In fact, Canada got a D. We then took the same criteria and we went back and looked at the same things going back the last 3 decades, so for 40 years. Are you surprised to learn that we have been a consistent D performer? I don't think so. Let me give you one example that I think will resonate. I thought of this example because here we are in this beautiful bucolic setting, Geneva Park. Crocs shoes. How many of you in this room knew that Canadians invented Crocs? Truthfully, how many of you knew? 10 of us. The plastic clog design was developed as a spa shoe by a Quebec company. It was called Foam Creations. It was acquired by an American entrepreneur who happened to be working in Quebec at the time, and he commercialized them into fashion shoes. Once deemed the fastest growing footwear company on the planet, Crocs had the largest IPO in the history of the shoe industry. And in 2008, its revenue was over $720 million, lost opportunity for us.
Because we have something that a lot of us call the Valley of Death, where many Canadian corporations get to 40 or 50 million, and the OECD stats show this straight line comparison of our generation of companies until it hits 40 to 50 million, and then we just drop like a rock. There is a huge gap, and whether it's venture capital or other forms of finance or intellectual property protection or all the various things that go into commercializing, we as a country better solve that. Because if we don't solve that, that feeder system of the next rim is not there.
So the financial meltdown of the last few years, in my view, is more due to government failure than to market failure. Why is Canada doing relatively well now? Again, some of the answers have been given throughout the course of our sessions. Our government never created such a real estate bubble as was created in the United States. There was a little experimentation with subprime instruments, but the governments drew back. We don't have the same kind of racial politics in Canada to drive that issue as they do in the United States. And so there was a real estate bubble in Canada, but it wasn't nearly of the dimensions that was in the United States, so we didn't have nearly as much bad debt to deal with. Also, our financial position was stronger, or I should say our fiscal position was stronger in Canada, because we had learned from the experience that began in the 1970s and carried on through the 80s and into the early 90s of running year after year of unbalanced budgets.
Well, there is ample evidence to say that when it comes to the role of the government, yesterday's modus operandi wasn't even good enough for yesterday's good times, let alone tomorrow's bad times. It did not prevent the recession, and it does not prepare us for the future. Business as usual is simply not enough. The difficult task of preparing for tomorrow starts by actually looking beyond the business cycle and fixing our sightlines on the 3 challenges that face us that are of the most enormous consequence: the aging society, climate change, and rising inequality. All 3 of these challenges are transforming us, and they will continue to transform us. Not unique to Canada by any means, the great tsunami, environmental degradation, and a growing gap between the rich and the rest of us will threaten our status quo economically, ecologically, and politically. And it will make us sicker, individually and as a society, if not addressed. Simply put, these challenges threaten our well-being. They demand a response by government, not after the fact, but in anticipation of these threats. The primary role of government, as Tom has said, is after all the duty to protect, and not just from external threats or internal chaos. And indeed, these threats are threats of our own making.
The direction of drift in Canada is the erosion of the public space. It's the erosion of the public space. We've seen the dramatic reduction in trust in government. Now, I'm not talking about the paternalistic state's over, the endless growth of government's over. Those days are done. Nobody's going to argue that. That's a straw man. Nobody's going to argue that. That's not the issue. And the notion that we've learned to not be deferential, to push government back when it touches our civil liberties. We don't want government in the bedroom. We want our private space. Although, you know, if we pause, thank goodness family violence is no longer private. But so we've wrestled and learned through trial and error the balance of public and private. We're not talking about big government. 2 minutes? Thank you so much for your attention. We're not talking about big government. We are talking about what kind of government do we need to build the country that we have with respect for the unique things only markets can do. It's not disrespectful of the market. It understands the market has no moral center. The market is the market. So you can trade in slaves or you can trade in commodities. The market's the market. Government and the market in partnership has been the Canadian magic. So, do we want the gradual erosion of our social programs because we're afraid to talk about taxes? I don't think so, but that's where we're going. Do we want the erosion of our social programs because we won't stand up for public service? Public service has to reinvent itself, but surely it's not the enemy. Do we really want to choke off the information that's necessary to do government well, to work with civil society, to hold government accountable? I don't think so. So there are some immediate things that we have to do, which is an honest talk about taxes, an honest talk about information, and an honest talk about the value of public service, elected, not elected, and a real debate about what kind of country we want, not an ideological debate about big government versus small government. Thank you.